Hi, hello, how you doing? Today I wanted to talk about how to write conflict in your story. Every single story that you write, whether it be a short story, a novella, or a full-on novel, needs conflict. And the longer your story is, the more of conflict that you're going to need. So knowing how to write conflict is integral to be able to write a good book that people will enjoy. However, conflict is bigger than two characters smashing swords against each other. So today I want to talk to you about how you can write better conflict for your stories that makes your book stand out. Conflict can be described as a clash between two opposing forces that creates the narrative thread of a story. It is a culmination of the problems that your characters go through throughout the course of the story that drives your story forward. Without conflict, there isn't any story. Now, conflict also exists on multiple scales. You have the main conflict, which is what is written on the back of the book and what most people will talk about in their reviews and what ultimately draws them in to actually read your story. Let's take the book and movie It, just to take a popular movie that everyone's gonna know. The main conflict there would be the Losers Club versus Pennywise. However, alongside the main conflict, there's also going to be other conflict that takes place throughout the course of your story, whether it be still in the main plot or in subplots. There's going to be conflict and conflict and conflict. Just think of it like those dolls that you can buy online where it's like you open up one doll and there's a smaller doll inside. You open up that doll and there's another smaller doll inside. You open up that doll and there's another one inside, and so on and so forth. That is also how conflict works. Different pieces of conflict, small pieces of conflict, all work together to create the main conflict in your story. Like how each brick works together to create a house, each piece of story works together to create the ultimate conflict of your book. So in order to understand how to write conflict, we first have to understand what different types of conflict exist. Amongst the writer community, there are 6 types of conflict that are mainly recognized everywhere. I'm 100% sure that if you get creative enough, you can add a 7th one and even an 8th one in there. But these are the ones that generally are talked about most within the writer community and the ones that you will usually find within books. It is more rare to find other ones. So first is the character versus self. This is often inner conflict where the character is essentially fighting with themselves about how to move forward or to solve a situation or just something that is going on in their life. As I said, this is often internal, so their self-esteem, maybe they're struggling with mental health issues, they are stuck at a dilemma that they can't really get themselves out of, etc. Then there is character versus character. This one is one of the easiest ones to recognize. Just think hero versus villain. That's character versus character. But also just characters who, while they're technically on the same side, maybe just don't get along. Their personalities are just too vastly different that they don't necessarily get along, and that can create conflict between them. Number 3 is character versus society. Think the outcast in your community, the one that is sitting there with all of these theories about the government and about Area 51 and aliens are spying on us and the government is tapping into our phones and blah 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 blah. That person versus the rest of society. That is the more, I guess, stereotypical version of it, but that is kind of how you can see it. Your character is standing up for something that maybe the rest of society doesn't necessarily agree with or is more hesitant towards, which then creates conflict. Character versus supernatural. This is your main character versus anything supernatural related. Ghosts, demons, angels, stuff like the Wendigo, or anything that we read about in horror stories or that we have some kind of mythology on. Even things like gods or deities can fall under that umbrella. Just anything that, unless you are a pagan or a witch or a Wiccan, most people consider to be fairy tales, and oftentimes more evil kind of stuff to begin with. Your character versus technology. This is what you would usually find in sci-fi novels. I personally haven't written it myself before, so I don't know too much about it, but it's just what it implies. Your character versus any type of technological advancement, the way that some people now are against AI, myself included. I am heavily against AI. Or people versus robots. Just anything, usually again in sci-fi novels, which I haven't written before, so I can't really talk too much about this one without looking further into it. And then lastly, there is character versus nature. You know those end of the world movies, like the one 2012? Just any natural disaster, a tsunami, a tornado, a massive earthquake, forest fires, anything relating to a natural disaster falls in this category. Also things like pollution. There are novels out there that are more dystopian. That is about a dystopian world where people are being displaced from entire countries or whatever, because the earth and the air and the oxygen there are just so polluted from what we humans have done to the planet. And just as a side note, you can 100% have multiple types of conflict within your story. For example, you can have character versus character, as well as character versus supernatural, specifically magic. If two characters, even if they aren't necessarily antagonists and protagonists, let's say they just don't get along within the group, they get into a little scuffle, a little fight, and they both pull out their magic to settle the score, if you will. That's character versus character and character versus supernatural right there. So you can 100% have multiple types of conflict within your story, and even at the same time. Now it is time to look at how to actually implement it into your story. Now these aren't all of the ways to do it. There are many ways to put conflict inside of your story, and it truly is so individual that it is impossible to talk about each and every way to do it. And how you ultimately do it is up to what your story looks like and what it needs. So even with these following tips, you can stretch them, bend them as much as you need to, depending on what your story needs. Number one is the most simple and the one that we will all recognize. Give your character a goal and put something in their way to prevent them from getting it. This is the most common, in my opinion, type of conflict that you're going to see. It's literally there almost every single time in the inciting incident. And it's one of the earliest types of conflicts that you will see as well because of that. Your character wants something, and maybe they are already living it or living something close to it enough that they are somewhat at peace and happy and just content with how their life currently looks. Or at least not enough that they're packing up all of their stuff and leaving for some big adventure. And all of a sudden, something happens and all of that is gone. Or what they want is all of a sudden out of reach. It's the most, again, common form of conflict that I have seen within stories, and it is the most common one that you will see with beginner writers because it's the one that we all recognize. It's also a great starting point to bring in other types of conflict like character and character, or character versus supernatural, and so on and so forth. Because this thing that is now standing in their way could be anything. This could be a character, this could be society, this could be something supernatural like a ghost or some type of a demon. So oftentimes your antagonist, who may be something other than human, this could be their house getting torn to the ground because of a tornado. So it really could be anything, and that means that you can also bring in different types of conflict through that. It's usually the basis of any type of conflict, but you can add to it that it gets pushed more to the background. And for example, if it is a character that is causing the conflict, the character in turn is pushed more forward, whereas the base type of conflict gets more pushed to the background. Just look at any book that you have on your shelf and the inciting incident. It's the basis for most of the conflict that you will find in there, especially in the beginning of your story. Because this way of bringing in conflict, it's very broad in the way that you can do it. It could just be the character wants to go from the living room to the kitchen, but on their way there something falls on their foot and now they're holding their foot desperately still in the living room while taking care of it. On the other end of that spectrum, it could be their house gets burned to the ground by this tyrant king, and even bigger than that, it could be whole entire wars that are very simply caused by I want something, but something in my path is saying no. Number 2 is to give your character someone that they can fight with. And then I don't just mean your villain. We all have someone in our lives that we don't necessarily get along with, but we can't always avoid them either. Your character may need someone like that. Here's the thing, under normal circumstances, these characters would probably just be able to avoid each other and thus avoid any kind of conflict. Cool, good. Now, in a book where stakes are high, there's a lot of conflict, there's a lot of stress, your character's patience with each other might not be as high, especially with somebody that they don't necessarily like. Meaning that the moment one steps on each other's toes, they might just blow up. And that might cause for some very interesting conflict. Especially if the chapter before that or the scene before that something very high stakes happened, meaning that there's a lot of adrenaline going. The characters are still coming down from a lot of stress, a lot of fear, a lot of frustration, anger, whatever, some kind of heightened emotion that has them in fight or flight. If then these characters come into contact, it's gonna blow. And this is just these two characters not liking each other and just being in the wrong space at the wrong time. But it can also be two characters who are forced to work with each other. Ultimately, they want the same thing, but they have very different ideas of getting there. So while they may not always necessarily intend to, maybe they do, they might be sabotaging each other. Conflict isn't always just these blow up moments. It isn't always characters trying to rid each other of their heads. It is also tension. It is being unsure, the characters being unsure of where they are going to go next because of tension that is hanging in the air, because of something that is in their way and trying to find a way around it. That in itself is conflict. And character versus character can really teach you how to write that, because it gives a really good example and will put you in a lot of situations as a writer where you can see the different levels of just how deep conflict can go, but also how superficial and petty it can be at times. So if you can, give your characters somebody, especially if you are a beginner writer or you want to learn how to write conflict in practice, someone that they can regularly have little fights and spats with. It's really going to teach you a lot as a writer. 3 is going to come as no surprise because I have talked about this before. Create a compelling villain. Without a villain, there is not going to be enough conflict to start off your story, or to just have a story in general, really. This is the ultimate force of conflict. Your villain is the biggest problem that your hero is going to face. Your villain is going to be powerful. They are going to be cunning. They are going to be smart. They are going to do every single thing that they can in their power to make sure that your hero doesn't succeed. Throwing conflict after conflict after conflict right at them. Even if they aren't necessarily involved themselves, they might send their minions. Your villain isn't always necessarily in the spotlight, but they will always be the number one person to make your hero's life a living hell. Which is why it is incredibly important to also know how to write a villain. And little shameless self-promo here, I do have a video on my channel on how to write compelling villains should you want some extra tips and tricks on that as well. They will never leave your main character alone. They will always cause conflict at times where the book is slightly slowing down, or some of the issues that your character has been facing are finally solving themselves, and then your villain shows up and they bring in more conflict. Connect your main plots and your subplots. Conflict is much more believable, as well as much more fun to read about when you have a story that is much more complex. The more complex your story is, the harder it's going to be for your characters to find a solution to their problem. It's also going to make it harder on you as a writer, but oh well. By connecting your main plots and your subplots well, that means that they are going to interweave. There are going to be points where they all come together and you can see the connection between them very clearly. Why, without certain subplots and those problems being solved, your main plot can't advance either. Those are the points where a lot of conflict is going to come up, but it is also going to cause you to be able to write conflict that is believable and that is really going to be able to engage your story. Now, I'm not going to go too deep in on this because that topic is something for its own video and I really do need to plan that out before I talk about any of that. But just to give an example of what I mean, your side characters, so the ones that aren't part of like the main crew but are still like important enough to be there, they're often more tied to subplots. But those characters are also integral to your main cast's character development. So those two need to have interaction. Therefore, your character also needs to have interaction directly with those subplots. And those subplots, while they are more in the background, truly play an important role in your character's development, as well as ultimately the main plot itself. Meaning that those two need to interact and the conflicts between them are also going to interact. And oftentimes when we have these big like blow-ups in books, like fight scenes or whatever, it is because those two interact and cause an explosion. Not always, because sometimes your villain may just have had a bad coffee this morning and they're feeling like causing ruckus. But oftentimes, all of your subplots and main plots come together, knock heads, and that is when you have these big blow-ups. So both of them are equally important, but you also need to be able to understand how they are connected in order to make sure that they actually all need to exist. And that ultimately is what is going to bring your book to perfection, and it is also why you need so many damn editing rounds. And lastly, decide how your character reacts to failure. How we react to failure also gives a hint towards our mental state. And how your mental state is also determines how much you can actually handle in everyday life, like conflict. Conflict, obviously, is never fun. But some character can go through something and be like, okay, I can pick myself up from this, while another character is going to be like, I'm done. Full breakdown, can't go on, feels like their life is completely ending. They just can't do it anymore and they ultimately break down. So you have to know how your character reacts to failure. and decide from there what kind of conflict you're going to introduce, how that is going to look, and thus how they're going to react to it. Their reaction ultimately is also going to change how your book moves forward. If your character decides, okay, this sucks, but we gotta go through it anyway, you're gonna go in a straight line forward with the main plot, right? If your character has a full-on breakdown, you need to take a little side lane to first get your character back to their feet so that they can move forward with the story. If your character's father died in the story and they are still actively grieving, let's say they died the day before, and you've determined with where they are in the story, okay, we just had this major blow up, and now it needs to calm down. If your conflict is character versus character, side character says something horrible about their father, you cannot expect your main character to have a small reaction to that, because that doesn't make sense. They are still actively grieving. 48 hours ago their father was alive and now they are dead and they will never talk to them again. So that is going to cause a lot of conflict. Now, if this were to happen later on, dad has been dead for a few years, their reaction might be less heavy. So you have to decide, how will my character, with where they are at mentally, how high the stress levels are, and what they just went through, react to this specific conflict. If I were to throw this at them, how would they react? And from there you can decide whether this conflict is something that you should bring into your story, or for now should leave behind until they are in a different place, have had more character development, or if this is something that you should scrap altogether. And these were some tips on how to write conflict. I hope that this video was helpful for you. Let me know if you got something new from this video, if you learned something that you think might help you while writing your story. If you have any questions, let me know in the comments down below. Like this video if you enjoyed it or if you found it helpful, and I will see you next Saturday. Bye bye.